everyone, I'm so excited to take you today from program to process, how we think about designing for equity in the organization. But before we dive in too deep, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Roman aqueducts. Now, I'm sure this is where you thought we were going, but I promise there's a point. So the Roman aqueducts were an incredible marvel of engineering that allowed the city of Rome to support a population much larger than it would have otherwise. But there was something about it that wasn't quite as amazing. And that's that the pipes that carried that water into the city were lined with lead. Just like what we're seeing in Flint, Michigan, it turns out that those pipes were poisoning the people that they were meant to help. And I'd love for us to take this metaphor forward as we think about the way that sexism, racism, ageism, all the other isms and ists that we see are actually built into the foundation of our organizations. And so if we want to truly build diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplaces, we need to try to get the lead out. And that's what equitable design is all about. So why am I talking to you about it? The reason is I'm the Mathpath. It's what they call me. My name is Aubrey, and I'm the Director of Equitable Design for Product and People at Culturati. And when they call me the Mathpath, what they're saying is that I'm a math nerd plus an empath. And really, that's the key to equitable design, is thinking and rooting our work in deep social science and sociological inquiry, but also grounding it in the fundamental dignity and value of every person. So now I want to talk a little bit about how we define the outcomes in this space, because we hear a lot of these words, diversity, inclusion, intersectionality, belonging. How do you think about how all of these concepts hang together? It turns out it's a lot more complicated than you think. So first, let's talk about diversity. I am the first person to say that I hate this word. Not the concept, not what we're going for, but often we use the word diversity. It's a blurry word. It means everything, and so therefore it means nothing. My research in the Atlassian 2018 State of Diversity report showed, for example, the word diversity is associated primarily with two groups, white women and Black Americans. And what that means is the word diversity can hide corporate white feminism while pretending to support Black equity. And so I rather think about something else. Now, inclusion. I often tell people that inclusion is an important step, but not quite good enough. So what we know is that it doesn't feel great to be included. It's kind of like being tolerated. And so there's higher order concepts that we want to get to. And that's belonging. So when we have an inclusive environment, individuals feel like they belong. And what belonging is broken down into two really easy parts. First, being seen for who you are authentically, and then being valued for that authenticity in the workplace. And we know that that experience is often very uneven for different groups at work. And instead of talking about diversity, I'd love for us to talk about equity. And the reason this is important is because when we focus on diversity as an outcome, as you've seen with the very, very little progress that many companies have made, is that we don't actually get there the right way. And so by focusing on creating equitable processes and equitable experiences, we are actually more effective at building balanced workplaces. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the design principles for equitable design, because you can absolutely do this with a few hints from me. So the first design principle is consent. It's important to always be aware of the power dynamics of asks that are being made and knowing that consent needs to be full and informed. So I think about this, a great example is asking someone to help with ERG work. We have to be conscious that when they're saying yes, that means they may be deprioritizing work in their formal role, which could negatively impact an ERG lead's career trajectory. And so when we're making that ask, we're not just saying, would you like to be an ERG lead, but also, and what support do you need to make sure that that work is recognized in the organization as a part of your role? That's the difference between diversity and equitable design work. Next, marginality. So what we know is that most DEI, D&I work starts with, let's start with gender. And what we end up is DEI programs that primarily benefit straight, white, cisgender, economically privileged people, which Certainly, we know that they face more barriers than their male counterparts, but it's not really the same thing as organizational transformation. And so within equitable design, we think about designing for the margin. Often that means designing for Black women. And the reason for that is because we know when we create a workplace where Black women can thrive, or queer women of color can thrive, or disabled veterans can thrive, we know that those people, including those straight, white, cisgender, economically privileged women, will have a better experience too. So when we design for the margin, we design for more people rather than making exclusion more extreme for those who are already on the edges of the culture. Next, community. I like to embody this by saying nothing for you without you. And what we mean by that is we know that the best solutions come from the community. And so we always try to engage the people involved in the work in building what we're creating, in the design and in the feedback loop and process of what we're doing. And the last one is progression. We know that in equitable design, we're not looking for perfect solutions to every problem, but we're looking for practical ways that we can move our work forward. Think of it like Agile for social justice. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the journey of going from D&I to equitable design. So first, we've heard a lot of statements of intention, including after the video of George Floyd went viral. We saw a lot of companies that said, we stand with Black Lives Matter, but we didn't hear a lot about what that meant in terms of changing their overall outcomes. And so in D&I, rather than making statements of intention, we take accountability for our outcomes. And you are welcome to keep me honest on this. You can check out not only the statement of commitment that Culture Amp made in June 2020, but you'll also at cultureamp.com/anti-racism be able to see not only the strategic plan that we authorized as part of this work, but also the anti-racism accountability report that we released in March 2020 to show how we met those commitments. Next, we're moving from programs. So thinking about, for example, a leadership program for people of color, and rather we're thinking about creating structural interventions that change the system. So this could still be a leadership program, but rather than implementing a leadership program because it's considered a best practice, we would only run that program if our data showed us, for example, that people of color were having challenges in gaining career progression and mobility. So again, thinking about structural interventions in the system rather than checking off a list of best practices. And as I said before, we're moving away from the start with gender, corporate white feminism of it all, and really thinking about designing for the marginal experience, because we know that when we do that, we strengthen our entire culture. We're also moving away from talking about people as diverse, because first of all, unless you're calling people from the majority group stereotypes, which you definitely should not, people aren't diverse. Diversity is a team level construct. So I want everybody to raise their hand. Yes, in our Year of Lord Beyonce 2021, we promise we are not calling anyone diverse again. And you might be thinking, Aubrey, what am I supposed to say about the people who are underrepresented or historically minoritized? And my answer to you is, why don't you use underrepresented to mean a person, which also helps us shine a light on the structural issue within the organization, rather than using these neutral terms or these blurry terms like diverse. The word diverse allows us to skirt around the deep, heavy work that's required here. And I would invite you to start talking about balanced teams. Not every team will be balanced in the same way, but it's also very clear that a balanced team is better than an unbalanced one. And while I think we all have read all of the ironclad research on the business case for diversity, the fact is that diverse and homogenous are not obviously better, right? And so we need to use that language of underrepresentation to constantly be highlighting the structural issues, and balanced as a way to talk about it. And then we have more productive conversations about balanced in what way and imbalanced in what way. And it has the side benefit of making sure that you don't have to have that fight about whether diversity is better, because no one's going to die on the hill of an imbalanced team being more high performing than a balanced one. And the last piece of this is we often have to stop thinking at the company level and start to think at the team level. So what we know is that the unit of diversity and the unit of belonging is really in the team. And the reason this is powerful is not only because it helps you run a better strategy, but also because the average manager has absolutely no idea what they can do to impact the culture of the whole company, but they can feel empowered to impact the culture on their whole team. And so you're building a framework that actually allows people to make progress in ways that they can feel, which is core to them continuing on what is a progression, a continuous and agile journey. So now I want to talk about what the new playbook for doing equitable design at work and creating the kind of spaces that we've always wanted to is. So before we talk about organizations again, I want to pause and back up. The first step in equitable design is to know yourself. And why is this so important? In order to think about why you haven't gone to equitable design before, you need to know why you haven't acted before. And this should not be an exercise full of shame, but rather it should be an exercise in understanding your own blockers. So your answer could be, well, I didn't know about equitable design. Well, that tells you that what education is the solution, or maybe I wasn't sufficiently motivated. That's okay, but you need to be honest with yourself about why that was and what's changed now, because we want to lock this in for the long term. This is not a short-term strategy. And if there is a question that I could give you that would embody equitable design the most, it would be this one. Always ask yourself in every interaction you have, in every program that you're developing, does this help create equal power or equal opportunity? If your answer to that is no, you want to go back to that equitable design drawing board. Now, we've just given you a question, but if I'm honest, you have to question everything, because remember what I said about getting the lead out. Every bit of our companies were created to produce inequitable outcomes. We know that that's true, even though it probably was not done intentionally, it happened. Whether it's racist practices in hiring, like requiring certain GPAs or requiring certain degrees, to actual outright discrimination, we have to question why. And my question for you is, always ask, why can't we choose differently? Because the answer is almost always, we can choose differently. And when we choose differently, whether that's in how we show up at work, how we run our teams, or how we build strategic corporate programs, doing it differently is what is going to create those equitable outcomes. And most of the people best practices have historically been designed around inequitable outcomes unintentionally. And so we need to really, really scrutinize everything we've learned before. Now, I want to move a little bit into the practice of equitable design. So moving into practice, I have one request for you, which is, you've heard a lot from me, a lot of ideas, but please make this real in your workplace, because right now people are suffering. People are being treated unjustly because of who they are, and you have the incredible opportunity to right that wrong. And that truly is the definition of changing the world. So I want to talk a little bit about how equitable design might show up in effective assessments. Assessments we do all of the time, whether that's in hiring, performance, whether that's in high potential programs, which, by the way, high potential programs, terrible name. Everyone has high potential if given the right support. The quote that always gets me with that is, if we expect a fish to climb a tree, we will always think that it's not amazing. So remembering that assessments are the most important part of an organization when thinking about equitable design. Data collection and how you assess people, because those assessments are tied directly to both the economic and experiential opportunity that people have in the workplace. So what do you need to think about when you want to build effective, equitable assessments? So first, you need to be able to look outcomes focused. So how would that show up in a recruiting or a job ad? Well, first of all, you would be writing things like 5 years of experience with, that's not an outcome. That's requiring that people have taken a particular path that's probably only available to the privileged. And so instead, think about focusing on outcomes, experience delivering strategic programs for individuals with disabilities. Great. That looks at the outcome of the skill and the ability, not how we got that skill. Effective assessments create a lot of structure that allows and limits the application of human bias. It's also audited. So one of the things you need to know is that collecting data and auditing all of your people processes is a non-negotiable part of equitable design. Because organizations are living, breathing groups of people, they will change over time. And so just running one inclusion survey one time, for example, is not going to create the large scale transformation that you're looking for. It's about consistently auditing over time. And feedback. So again, making sure that the people involved in the process are given the ability to give feedback on their experience. These 4 points are so crucial because what the social science research tells us is that when people feel that they've been treated fairly in a process, or the fancy way to say that is they've experienced procedural justice in a process, they're more likely to accept the outcome of that process, even if the outcome wasn't something that they wanted. So again, outlining here that equitable design is the core foundation of creating not only equitable teams and experiences, but also highly engaged, high-performing ones. Because we know that the human brain is exquisitely sensitive to unfairness, and that unfairness leads to a huge drop in cognitive performance and capacity because someone is worrying about their treatment. So going on, again, we talked about the question of, does this create equal power, equal opportunity? In the assessment space, I might zhuzh up that question to say, does this assessment measure privilege or does it measure ability? The great example that I like to use here is about attending a top 25 university in the United States. Does anyone know, and you can drop it in the chat, does anyone know what is the #1 characteristic of someone that tells you whether they would have gone to a top 25 university in the United States? Well, the answer is how much money your parents have. And you know how I said personal characteristic? That's not actually a personal characteristic. And so again, really thinking about going back to that, how do we start with outcomes as a way to create more access and opportunity? Now, I want to talk specifically about how we would design an equitable assessment within a performance review. I've used a lot of examples from recruiting, but I will tell you that performance reviews are the #1 tool of the equity warrior. And so I want to talk to you about what that would look like. So first, you want to design the assessment. Make sure that it's outcomes focused, that it's audited, that you've had community feedback on that process. When I was the Chief Diversity Officer at Atlassian, what we did was we actually built a process and tested it with about 25% of our managers in a fake cycle. And so you truly can run a whole process, because the second step is to test the system. So whether that's a small pilot study with a group of managers, or whether it's getting feedback from the community, make sure that just that your design intention was right doesn't mean that your design impact is right. And so testing is crucial, because while there are some best practices in this space, the fact is that equity will look slightly different at each organization. And so understand that there will be pieces of this that you are discovering for the first time, which is how you bring this theory alive and extend it. Once you test the system, make sure that you have in place an auditing and monitoring strategy. The platinum standard is to be able to audit the system while the process is running so that you stop discrimination or potential inequity in its tracks. But I know that for a lot of people, they don't have the analytical resources, and that's not a realistic possibility. And that's okay. We can hold that out as our ideal. A gold standard would be auditing after the fact and making adjustments to your future processes. All right. And next, you should reveal your audits to your calibration groups if you're able to audit live. Why does this matter? This is incredibly important because human beings like to have a say in the outcome, and you can drive your calibration groups, your managers, your leaders to have more objective, productive conversations if they're aware of the way that their biases are slipping into the process. Because here's the truth. You can't eliminate bias in a performance process. There's simply too many ways that human judgment is subjective, but you can drive people towards objectivity by giving them real-time feedback on their decision-making. You also have to re-audit final outcomes. So in equitable design, we don't take any chances. We take many chances in terms of innovating on solutions, but we don't take chances on auditing our processes because we want to make sure that, like I said, our design intention and our design impact were equivalent. And we always consider impact over intent because impact is what lands in people's real lives. And then 6, have a process that allows your employees to challenge inequity and make sure that they have a way, even if that's just designating someone on your HR team to take employee relations cases related to performance equity. So again, not that complex, just a little bit of pre-thinking in the way that you run processes helps you build more equitable processes at the system or the company level. But you're gonna say, Aubrey, didn't you just tell me that we should be focusing on companies, not companies, and focusing on teams? And I totally did say that. And now I want to talk about how you lead teams in a way that is equitably designed. And we're going to talk about that through the lens of meetings. So thinking about how to equitably design meetings. First, think about balancing out your attendees. So we know, for example, that often meetings are allocated by seniority, but be really thoughtful to make sure that not only all of the right people are in the room, but also that they know why they're in the room so that everyone feels empowered to speak up. Agenda. Send an agenda 24 hours in advance. There's a couple of different reasons why this is super important. So first, it's just good meeting hygiene, but it also supports your attendees in understanding what they need to do. It also helps introverts show up better in meetings. So what we know is that introverts often need time to process before contributing, and this makes sure that the loudest voice isn't always the first one in the room. Interrupt the interrupters in meetings. So research shows that women are interrupted 3 times more often when speaking than their male peers. And while we don't have rigorous data on this, it's safe to assume that women of color experience that even more in the process. And so this doesn't have to be something that's rude, but maybe let's say Sally is speaking and Jonathan wants to say something as cutting in. That can be something as simple as, hey, Jonathan, which, by the way, a trick here is to actually use someone's first name. We're exquisitely tuned to hearing our names. And so when you want to interrupt the interrupter, just something like, hey, Jonathan, I'm really excited for what you want to contribute, but I'd love to hear the rest of what Sally had to say first. Really simple, no shaming, but what it does do is create more opportunity for more people to be speaking up and to be heard. Rotate the office housework. I think by now, most of us are familiar with the idea that women, other minoritized people, especially women of color, are often tasked to do the administrative and housework of the team, which doesn't come with the same career opportunities. And so what I'd suggest is creating a schedule for things like organizing things, being a scribe or a note taker, that can help build skills across the team, but also doesn't fall into a space where you're tokenizing or you're creating career blocks for those underrepresented people. And last, challenge the devil's advocate. What I mean by that is very often people want to engage in an intellectual thought exercise about whether equity is important. And the fact is, we are dealing with an aggressively racist, sexist, ageist, ableist, all the other ists society, and the devil doesn't need any more advocates. And so when someone wants to run an intellectual exercise questioning the lived experience and real suffering of another person, you can decline to have that debate. For some people, this is not simply an intellectual, fun conversation, but especially if you're a manager, a leader, or in a position of authority or power, saying, you know what, if we want to have that discussion, we can have that in a sidebar another time. It doesn't mean that you shut down questioning and learning, but really think about contextually, is the devil's advocate who we need to be bringing in this exact moment? Now, I want to talk about building equitable one-on-ones. So not that hard, but first is share your intentions. So this can work in a one-on-one meeting or just as you're building relationships with underrepresented people. So certainly, I said earlier, statements of intention are not enough, and it's true, they're not, but you should state them anyway when you're building a relationship and you want to build trust across a line of difference so that you can pull those people into the community and have a more thoughtful, equitable design view. Share your intention. And this doesn't have to be something big. An example, my associate business manager at the Mathpath, I shared with her that it was important for me that she was in a workplace that was free of racism, something that would be very important to her. And I said, so if you experience racism from me, you are absolutely allowed to come to me with that, and I will make sure I do not do it again. But secondarily, if you experience racism from a customer or a vendor, please just let me know, and I will fire that person and we will find someone who guarantees that your experience is positive. Just said that, I wrote a check that hasn't been cashed yet, but really encourage you to state the intention of what you want for that person. I can tell you how many managers I've seen do this and how impactful it is, because frankly, so many don't. And it's a small win. But you may not get trust right away because of that, and that's okay. So if you're in a more privileged position, the second step is to process with your people. What I mean by that is it's not useful to go to your underrepresented employee and say, oh my gosh, I feel so bad about X, Y, Z that's happening to your community. You don't need to have them do emotional labor for you, but rather process with your people. So I, as a white passing mixed race Latina, even though I experience racism, it's in a very different way than my darker skinned members of my community or the Black community, for example. And so I make sure that I process up the color line. So I'm looking for people who are either also white passing or who are white, who can hold the space for me, because I don't need to take that labor from someone. This is something you can do as well. And it applies to your people, whether that has to do with disability, whether that has to do with gender. This works for all axes of difference and can work also for intersectionally marginalized identities. This last thing, ask for feedback. It's really important. You shared your intention to come back, and the best question for getting feedback, what's something I could have been 10% more inclusive doing? So the reason it's compelling to ask the question like that is people are more likely to be able to give you something that you can work on. For me, about every 6 months or so, I send out a feedback request to people that I regularly work with, saying, what are ways that I've made you feel included? What's one way I've made you feel included that I should continue doing? And a second question, what's one thing I've done that's made you feel excluded that I should stop doing or should evolve as a practice? And what's amazing is after a few revs of doing that in a structured way, I start to get that feedback more organically because people are seeing that I am responding to feedback that I'm getting. And this is something that every single one of you can absolutely do. I am biased, but I use the Culture Amp feedback tools for this, and that has been great because I have a record of all of my inclusion feedback that I've gotten, so I can track over time if I'm doing better. Now, you just have to trust and accept that trust takes time. So often, I heard a founder told me today, she said, yeah, it's like a bank deposit. You have to put trust deposits in all the time. So when something goes wrong, and when you're doing equitable design, I guarantee that it will, that you have that insurance of seeing that your intentions and your impact have lined up repeatedly, and that you're open to hearing when you have dropped the ball, because we all drop the ball. I'm an expert in this space, and I can tell you that my first trip to Atlassian Sydney, when I was the head of diversity there, I used a word that in Australia was considered a slur and was an empowering word in America. And I was lucky enough to have an incredible teammate who pulled me aside and set me straight. So that was, I will admit, pretty embarrassing and pretty hard to hear when I had intended to make everyone feel included. But at the end of the day, I didn't hit the brief. And so again, understanding that trust takes time, and in fact, how you respond to messing up can build that trust. And the last piece is stay aware and check in. So when you are working with people from underrepresented communities, it's important to know what's impacting them. It's important to know, Culture Amp, we focused on anti-racism over the last year. It was important for me to understand not only, for example, that Chadwick Boseman passed away, but also the impact that that had on the Black community because of what he stood for and what he created in the world. And that I was able to go to my mentee, who was a Black man, and say, hey, no pressure and no need to respond. I'm just reaching out because I imagine you may be feeling very affected. If there's something I can do for you, I'm here. But as a reminder, here are leave policies if you need some extra space. So checking in, not asking for myself to be helped, but just making sure that people know that I'm with them. So really what I'm telling you is that equitable design is adjusting your DEI work by 1%. Every day, think about, can you be 1% more inclusive? Because that 1% over time scales to huge compound interest. The last couple of lessons I want to leave you with are, you already know how to do this. It requires the skills that you have in organizational management, humility, in strategic planning and execution. You just need the community to help you apply those skills in a way that creates transformational change. And the last thing I would say is, this work can be emotionally exhausting. Honor that in your work, but think always about taking rest, not bowing out. Because we know that for those of us who are impacted by these systems, we don't get to quit. We barely get to rest. And so if you have the ability, rest quietly, get up and continue the journey. So I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I'm incredibly honored to be speaking at Culturati in front of you, and hope that you take these ideas, apply them in your workplace, and extend them. Come tell me how you've made it even better, because ultimately we're going on this journey together. Thank you, everyone.